John was mentioning October 22nd, 1863, and I was reminded of another October the 22nd. I just want to remind you about the night. It was a Tuesday, October 22nd, 1962. I remember it vividly. Anybody else remember Tuesday, October 22nd, 1962? Anybody know why we remember that? The beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was the night President Kennedy addressed the nation, though. A very, very scary time indeed. It puts some of the recent foolishness we've endured in Washington into a little bit of perspective. Douglas L. Wilson is currently George A. Lawrence Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at Knox College, where he is co-director with Rodney O. Davis of the Lincoln Studies Center. Both of them are old friends of the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, as they won our annual Mike Maione Award just a few years ago. LDC's book discussion group, which Karen mentioned just a few moments ago, is devoting the current year to Herndon Lincoln, the landmark 2006 works they co-edited. Professor Wilson's work on Abraham Lincoln has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, American Heritage, Time, and the American Scholar, among numerous other magazines and scholarly journals, and has resulted in 6 books. 2 of his books, Honor's Voice, The Transformation of Abraham Lincoln, 1998, and Lincoln's Sword, The Presidency and the Power of Words, 2006, were awarded the Lincoln Prize. Mr. Wilson has served as a consultant for the Library of Congress, the National Park Service's Lincoln Home, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. At the invitation of the U.S. State Department, Mr. Wilson lectured in a dozen Chinese universities in 2009 on Lincoln and his legacy. Since next month marks the sesquicentennial of the Gettysburg Address, I thought it altogether fitting and proper that we should get a new look at the Gettysburg Address from none other than Doug Wilson.
Thank you very much, Craig. It's a pleasure to be back here. I remember when I first made my brash entrance into the Lincoln field, one of the first invitations I got was from this group, and I remember that what I had to say astonished many people, but they were polite. And Steve Carson made me squirm for my dinner by asking hard questions, but he too was a good. He was very dubious about what I was saying. I'm pleased to report that our friend, the late Steve, told me not too long before he died, really, that he remembered that session, and he was gracious enough to say that his doubts had been relieved, and he agreed with me with what I was arguing about. And of course, it was, as Greg says, only a few years ago that we were honored, my partner and I were honored for our editorial work by this group, and it was it's something that we are very proud of, and I can't thank you enough for that honor. You may not think that I've done you any favor of talking about the Gettysburg Address. Everybody knows the Gettysburg Address. Most of you can recite it, I'm sure. It's the most famous speech in the world. A lot of people think it's the best speech in the world. It's storied. There are endless mythology about it. And I know that the myths irritate some serious historians, but I think it's all part of the landscape. If you're going to have something great, it's going to have myths grow up around it. And that's just a sign that people take it seriously. It's one way to take something like the Gettysburg Address seriously. So, with my apologies, I want to try and say something about the Gettysburg Address, but rather than read you a paper, I thought I would try to see if we could do this in an open conversation. And while I'd be glad to take questions at the end, as is usual, I thought I would try doing it in an open fashion so that if what I'm talking about prompts a question, if you raise your hand and ask the question, if it doesn't lead us too far astray, I'd be glad to get involved in a conversation. But of course, I warn you, if I discover that we're going hopelessly off subject and the time limit, I'll cut you off and go on with the presentation. So the Gettysburg Address is something special, something unique. And we're getting ready to celebrate its 150th anniversary. And we've had enough good books about the address in the last 20 or 25 years that we know quite a bit about it. One of the last books that we had by Gabor Borat, called The Gettysburg Gospel, did a marvelous job of showing what happened from the time the speech was given to the point at which it had become iconic. It took a while, if you remember, and he laid that out very nicely and showed us. So it hasn't always had the stature that we give it now. It couldn't have had, but it's interesting to see the way in which, or to think about the way in which it's been held down through the years. It's probably the most mythologized of all of our historical speeches. I consider it the high water mark of American history. I've studied Jefferson and the Declaration, and in a way it isn't fair to compare these things. But important as the Declaration was, I think the Gettysburg Address is even more important. And I'll try to tell you something about that as I go along. So what I'm going to try and experiment here. What I want to do is I know that a lot of you know it, and you should be proud of that. Or if you're prompted, you can kind of get on the text and stay with it. So I'm going to read it slowly. I'll start the first sentence, and then I hope that the people who know the words can go along. We kind of get a chorus going here. We get the bass voices over here, and we get some higher tenor Abraham Lincoln voices going with it, and see what it sounds like. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Wow, this is terrific. But that's only the first sentence. Okay. Who knows how the next sentence begins? Anybody? Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Right. Next line. We are met upon a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's very good. That's very good. And once you get in, somebody else's kind of character, you can jump on every once in a while. So we all know that. Now that is one version of the Gettysburg Address, right? That's the final text. That's the last text that he wrote. Believe me, if he had kept making official copies, it would have changed a little bit. It wouldn't have changed much, I think. He's really incapable, I think, of always doing it the same way. He always has another thought, and he sees nothing wrong with putting the comma over here, or changing the position of this word if he thinks it would be better. He doesn't have the sense that he wants it frozen, which I think is probably a good idea. Let me just touch on a few places. I'm sure some of you are as well aware as I am of some of these things, but it's interesting what parts of the speech were different in some other version than the ones that we had. You may know that on this continent and upon this continent, he couldn't decide what he wanted. And maybe the next one, if he'd have done another version, he would have gone back to upon. But he back and forth on that one. He originally wrote, if we assume that the Nicolay version is the oldest version, and I do, he originally wrote, we have come to dedicate. But apparently at Gettysburg, he said, he repeated what he had said in the sentence before. We are met to dedicate. And in revising it, he saw that his first thought was the best. Rather than repeat, we are met, it somehow works better to say, we have come. And I think what's really remarkable is that he started with the sentence that we know as, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, originally said, this we may in all propriety do. That's an iambic pentameter, but it's flat. So it just shows you that, and I think he had an affinity for iambic, and perhaps even iambic pentameter. But that doesn't mean it always raises the level, the poetic level. In this case, this is a flat line. This we may in all propriety do. Nobody would ever choose that over it is altogether fitting and proper, even though fitting and proper is a cliche in a way. It's a familiar phrase. Somehow, if you can use a familiar phrase in the right place, it works very well. It's interesting that Lincoln, in all the versions that we have in his hand, always says, we cannot dedicate. 2 words, we cannot. The newspapers always put that together, so the newspaper versions always say cannot. But if you say them both and you try them, you see there's a difference, especially in a speech like this. We cannot dedicate. Also, seeing the value of a change, originally he wrote, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, while it can never forget what they did here. But the while isn't very strong, so he changes it to but. And so we get that really memorable line. And the but helps us see and feel the 2 parts of the sentence. And as you know, the oldest version, the so-called Nicolay version, is on executive mansion letterhead. And then it's connected to a different size sheet, a foolscap sheet, sheet of foolscap. in pencil rather than pen, so that what we have are almost certainly two parts. The first page of one draft, which used to have another second page, and the second page of a different draft that was originally in pencil. This juncture is part of the, if you're interested in the text, and the growth of the text and so forth, part of the puzzle about the fact that Nicolay, his secretary, claimed he was there when Lincoln put the finishing touches on his speech at Gettysburg, and that he had that draft in the papers of Lincoln, and he produces them, and argues even that they have folds, as though somebody folded it up and put it in his pocket. The trouble is that he didn't say the words. He made big changes, like the one change where he completely threw out the sentence, "This we may in all propriety do," but it isn't crossed off in the manuscript. And then there's a you know, the one point in the speech that I think gives one pause is he says the same thing twice, which you can do in a good speech and make it better. But he says it awkwardly, it seems to me. If we can say anything in this really fantastic speech is awkward. But when he says, "It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly," and he said in the speech, "carried on." He realized later on that he needed a stronger word, and he put in advanced. But he said carried on. And then he almost repeats it. "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us," the unfinished work. But then, somehow that sets up that really resonant series of that clauses. And so everything seems to be fine. It's interesting to me, although I don't believe that that the delivery manuscript that he held in his hand was the Nicolay copy, for reasons that I'll say in a minute. But it does make sense that he has trouble getting, if that were the case, it would explain why he has this sort of weak repetition of the unfinished work. The unfinished work, the great task remaining before us, because it comes right exactly at that point in the manuscript. In my analysis of it in my book Lincoln's Sword, I got interested in the kind of way that almost musical notation that he uses the word here, but that's a little technical. But I think he's the kind of rhetorician and rhetorical master who thought at that level. And I think if there's one criticism that some people make, it is that he took one of the here's out in this version, the Bliss version. And in the Everett and the Bancroft versions that come before, he had one more here, for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. The last one, he took it out. I still seem to want to hear it. And then there doesn't seem to be any doubt that he said, under God, in his ditch. There is a school of thought or a position that says that he ad-libbed it. I don't think that's the case, but at any rate, he changed the position. You know that he changed the position when he got to studying his text, getting ready to push it out in the world as an official text. All the reporters who reported, who had access to the reporter who had access to the manuscript and the stenographic reporter report that he said that this nation shall, under God, have a new birth of freedom. And I can't quite tell whether we've simply become so habituated to it coming after, shall coming after, than before, makes it seem like the right choice. But it is an interesting choice again. And as one who studied the manuscripts of Lincoln's compositions, this is one of the really interesting things. The changes that he tends to make are minor. And it changes the cadence, it changes the sound a little bit. It doesn't do much, but all these little changes are the change of a person who is hearing what would be making fine discriminations about what would sound better. Okay, what did Lincoln really say? This is what he wrote in March as a revision of his speech. The Bliss copy dates from March. What did he say at Gettysburg? Well, this is where the controversy begins. And if you like the controversy, this is where the fun begins. Clearly, what we've just had, what we all know, what we can recite, isn't exactly what he said at Gettysburg. And I've already pointed out a few of these things. But the words that he uttered are still debated. They're going to go on being debated. But the argument you would think that the argument would be settled now that we videotape everything. And if C-SPAN doesn't videotape you, your uncle will, with his phone. Nothing goes unvideotaped anymore. But the interesting thing is that doesn't solve the problem the way that you think it was. Let me give you just a little example of my own experience. To celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, my partner and I at the Lincoln Study Center determined that we wanted to bring out a new edition of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And they needed a new edition because what we had before was simply Lincoln's scrapbook, where he cut out the Chicago Tribune's editions of his speeches and the Chicago Times editions of Douglas's speeches. And that's what we got for the debates. And as you probably know, the debates in those days, even though they were supposed to be word for word and so forth, they were heavily politicized. Because even if the stenographer was honest and reported exactly what Lincoln said, if the editors didn't like that or thought it didn't sound right or was a mistake, take it out. We know this because the other side didn't have the same impulse. They were working it the other way. In fact, they didn't work for the paper, they worked for Douglas. And Lincoln was sure that they were editing his stuff. And the truth is that Lincoln says, I tried to get the reporter who reported for the Tribune to let me see his transcriptions, but he wouldn't let me see them. And as we know, his reporter who worked for the Tribune was a very, very good reporter because he was very much in demand in the law to take down transcriptions of important cases. So anyway, we wanted to have, to be able to, so we worked with both sides of the aisle, as it were, for our, and while we were working on it, we had the great good fortune at Knox College to have two wonderful, inspiring commencement speakers within 2 or 3 years. The first was a guy that we had just sent to the U.S. Senate from Illinois in 2005, and this was the guy who is now president, Barack Obama. And a few years later, we had former President Bill Clinton. And I was interested in the fact that the college taped the stuff, audio and video. And so I wanted to compare the transcriptions. In the case of Clinton, the Clinton people sent us a copy of what he said. And then the college made a transcription just from the videotape. And they didn't match. They weren't really far off, but they couldn't match. Because he didn't say exactly what was written in his speech. He did what most people do. He ad-libbed some. He probably ad-libbed a good deal. Anyway, it was what you could see is that if you're trying to get the exact text, what did he say precisely? I know what he said. I've got his own speech. Where did you get it? From his headquarters. Not a good idea. And one of the things that wasn't in the written speech that I thought was unfortunate was that at the beginning of his speech he made some informal remarks which were complimentary to one of my books. And I thought that belonged. And I was disappointed that it wasn't in the official transcript. And Obama's speech was very good. And not long afterwards, there was an issue of Time magazine dedicated to Lincoln, and they asked a number of people to write about Lincoln. And Obama did, and he talked about what was going on in his mind when he's sitting there watching the graduates march down the aisle and get ready for the program. And he said, what crossed my mind was, since he was sitting, I was sitting where Abraham Lincoln was trying to run for the Senate, trying to beat the incumbent Douglas. And even though he lost, it made it possible for me to be here in the Senate, which I thought was really remarkable. So anyway, what did Lincoln say in the speech? Well, we have 5 versions of it in his own hand. One of them is the earliest one that I talked about, the Nicolay. But the ones that represent his attempt to put down an official version are known as the Everett, the Bancroft, and the Bliss, which he did in February and March. That is to say, 3 to 4 months after the speech. And the accounts that we have of how he did this, what he used, suggests that he didn't go back to his own manuscript, or at least that's my sense of it. And the AP reporter who filed the speech that most newspapers used says that he didn't have a full set of notes because he got caught up in the moment, and that he simply copied Lincoln's speech afterwards. He gave permission to copy it. We have that text, and then we have a text by a very skilled stenographer, Charles Hale, who says that he was sure he got every word that Lincoln said, and he couldn't file this with his paper because he got caught in the jam. He couldn't get it through with the telegraph. The telegraph was full. Then he got caught in a bottleneck in the railroads. He couldn't get back to Boston for several days. And so he didn't get his version in his paper, but he published it later. And if you compare the two, the one that the stenographer took down and the AP reporter who says he copied Lincoln's manuscript, they're within a phrase or two the same text. This is fatal to the idea that he had the Nicolay in his hand, which is missing a good bit of material and has some other stuff, and he would have to ad-lib a good many things. So there isn't much doubt in my mind. But let me tell you about the newest book of about the writing of the Gettysburg Address, and it is, I think, the most ambitious book. It's a new book that's by Martin P. Johnson. It's called Writing the Gettysburg Address. I have had occasion to read over the years, while he's been working on this, it's been a number of years, his articles that he's written on various parts of aspects of the address, and I've also had the good fortune to read his book, which is just out, with some care, because I was reading it before it came out. And it is a very good book. It is certainly the most ambitious study of the address that we've had in a long, long time, and probably it's the most ambitious of all of them. And it tells us a lot of interesting things and clears up some puzzles and adds some things, gives us a lot of new interesting things to think about. And so I just wanted to say a few words about that because it's a book that you're going to be reading reviews of very soon, and I think it is a worthy effort. Let me give you an example of a couple of the things that he does that I think are really contributions to the study of the Gettysburg Address. He explains, I think, better than anybody ever has, that it took a lot of time to look into the way the telegraph system worked, how the newspapers used it, how things were transcribed, sent, and what he shows us is that some of the strange errors that occur in the telegraphic accounts are results of the telegraph kind of incremental errors that are made along the way. So that the Philadelphia papers, who I've forgotten the route that they were on, but at any rate, they're the most accurate because there are the fewest telegraphic glitches in it. And it shows you how telegraphic glitches down the road make people think that the editors reading this say, oh, this must mean this, and so forth. And so you get all these strange reports of the Gettysburg Address that are faulty because of the telegraph transmission. But you can use the telegraph transmission because they had 4 lines, one that went out to the north, the Boston area, one that went to the New York area, one went south through Baltimore, and one went west toward Chicago. But the western one, the lines were so busy they couldn't get their sent the first day, so they didn't send it until the second day. So this kind of information is interesting. We've always felt that these telegraphic errors are obscuring our perfect vision of what Lincoln actually said, but he helps a great deal with that. Another thing that I think that is really interesting is he gives us a rationale for the Hay manuscript. I wish I gave PowerPoint lectures so I could put up on the screen, you could see what the difference is between the Hay manuscript and the Nicolay manuscript. They're Lincoln's secretaries. Why aren't they the same? Well, we don't know, but probably the Hay manuscript is a document that Lincoln used in trying to work up an official version that he was going to send to Edward Everett, the guy who gave the big oration at Gettysburg, because he requested it. He said, I'm going to put the manuscript of my oration. I'd like to have the manuscript of your talk, and I'm going to sell these for the benefit of the soldiers, the Sanitary Commission. So Lincoln said, fine, I'll do that. Lincoln didn't send in the delivery manuscript. Why not? Well, he didn't seem to have it. The guy who ran the cemetery dedication, David Wills, had written him and asked him if he would donate the original manuscript. But Lincoln was sick in bed at that time. You may remember he came home sick from Gettysburg. He had a minor version of smallpox. He had to go to bed. And so he wasn't doing much business, and he doesn't seem to have gotten around to working with the text until Everett asked him in January to send him something. So I think that this doesn't seem to me to be the strength of Martin Johnson's book, because he is working on an admirable principle. He says, now look, why should we invent a lost manuscript if we have a manuscript that his secretary says is the manuscript that he finished in David Will's house and put in his pocket and took out and read from at Gettysburg. Granted, it doesn't those aren't the words that he said at Gettysburg, because the newspapers tell us that, but that's the manuscript. That way we don't have to invent one. Well, I think we need to invent one, because if the AP reporter says he copied it out and he's filed the story and they sent it out, and it's just almost exactly word for word what the stenographer says he took down word for word, there's no room for the Nicolai manuscript in the way I see it. So I don't think this is the strength of the book, but I think in showing us how the Hay manuscript makes perfect sense. It's hard to describe what's wrong with the Hay manuscript. It has things that, it seems to be a hodgepodge of manuscript, things that are known manuscripts, and things that are from known newspaper reports. I think he makes a very good case that the Hay manuscript comes in when Lincoln is trying to get back what he said and what he wants. He knows that the newspapers pretty much have it, but he wants to test it against his other manuscripts, and that he's using the Hay manuscript, which some people have argued is the delivery manuscript, is the one. So I really think if you're interested in that kind of history of the text, he's got a very good explanation of the Hay, much better, I think, than any we've had before. So I can say that. As I said, I think it's a very good book, very, very worthwhile. It is narrowly focused. He does have some interesting things to say about what happened at Gettysburg, what Lincoln did at Gettysburg, and some other events. But mostly he's talking about the text. And minutely going through accounts of what this person said and what that person said, and what, if you put these two together and discount for this and so forth, what that might mean. That's heavy going. Doesn't mean that it isn't worthwhile, it just means that it isn't very entertaining to read. And it is, it's like some legal problems. The law is so complicated. As John Adams says, my head hurts trying to figure this out. And your head can hurt a little bit in some of these arguments. But I think he is definitely contributing a good deal. And anybody who works with this is going to have a much better understanding of the problems and what the possible solutions are. So I commend the book. And I don't want to emphasize my misgivings, but I do think that he's got the wrong delivery text. He has an interesting, he makes an interesting point of some well-known testimony by James Speed. Speed was the Attorney General in 1864, and when he came to become Attorney General, he talked with Lincoln. Lincoln told him about the Gettysburg Address, he says. This is 14 years later. But it's a very interesting account of what Lincoln said. But it's taken by a reporter. These aren't Speed's words. This is the reporter telling what Speed said. When requested to deliver an address, he's telling us what Lincoln told him. When requested to deliver an address on the occasion of the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, he was very uncertain whether his duties would detain him at Washington. But he was anxious to go, and he desired to be prepared to say some appropriate thing. The day before he left Washington, he found time to write about half of a speech. He took what he had written with him to Gettysburg. There he was put in an upper room in a house, and he asked to be left alone for a time. He then, he then prepared a speech, but concluded it so shortly before it was to be delivered he had no time to memorize it. After the speech was delivered and taken down by reporters, he compared what he had actually said with what he had written. And the difference was so slight that he allowed what he said to remain unchanged. A lot of what Speed says here is corroborated. But I think that since Johnson makes such a heavy use of this is kind of the outline of his book, as he says. he's gotten this story, and he thinks it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and that he uses it as a kind of an outline. But I don't think he takes into account the fact that there are these difficulties. I mean, it's a great piece of testimony, but testimony always has problems. I'm not going to go into that any further, just except to recommend the book if you're interested in the textual history. But here's the question. Here's the real controversy, and it isn't it isn't such an energetic controversy as the textual controversy sometimes becomes. And that is, what is the Gettysburg Address about? What is Lincoln trying to say? What's the most important message for Americans then? And what is its most enduring message? Now, those things are worth thinking about. Consider the setting in 1863. And Johnson's book is very good on this, but Borak's book is even better, and that is the setting the scene. After the battle, the armies leave. Of course, the Confederate wounded are all left behind that they couldn't take. So and the Union Army can only take so many. And so the people of Gettysburg are left to tend the wounded. The dead are simply lying out there on the ground by the thousands. And the horses. Oh. And of course, all the broken and abandoned implements of war strew the battlefield. And for a while, it was really bad. It was dangerously bad. They had to get those bodies buried, and so it was not a pretty scene. By the time 4 months later, when they had the ceremony, they had gotten on top of the burial to a large extent. But consider that the people there were lots of soldiers, okay, just on their own time, soldiers on leave. Veterans of the battle, if they could get away, came. There were a lot of them. Relatives, widows, orphans of the people who were dead. At that, it was a very somber occasion. And this is something that, when we're looking at it on the page, is hard to contextualize. But it was the kind of occasion where everybody wept. The guy who gave the prayer was a famous preacher for prayers, and he did himself proud, and everybody wept. In the middle of Everett's very affecting 2-hour oration, the president was seen to be mopping his tears. And then when Lincoln read his, especially the second part of his address, you can imagine what it was like for people for whom this is a somber occasion, like a funeral, for Lincoln to say, "These dead are not who died in vain." As I like to point to the comment of George William Curtis at Harper's, just 2 weeks after the address. He says, it's the kind of thing that kindles emotion. You can't read it without feeling something strong. And for people who were involved in this way, it would have been clearly for them it was about the sacrifice of those men, those people who died for the cause. That's what the Gettysburg Address meant to them, and I think to the veterans for years and years and years, and relatives and people, they who continued to decorate graves and so forth. It was for a long time. That's what it was. It was about the soldiers who died at the battlefield. The one that, the other theme is the preservation of the Union, of course. This is Lincoln is saying the war is about the preservation. The public, he's saying the war is about the preservation of the Union. That's what we're doing. This is what he said about de Greeley, who was criticizing for not moving fast, quicker on slavery. It depends on what will preserve the Union, and that's what I'm going to do. If I have to free them all, if I can free some, not others, what he had already made up his mind to do. So the preservation of the Union had been a national issue, a strong national issue, growing national issue, got fierce in the 50s, but it went back at least to the Webster-Hayne debate of 1830, a debate that Lincoln would have memorized, and his contemporaries, and that would have been something like their Gettysburg Address. And at the level of the public's understanding, I think, insofar as they could divorce their own grief, personal grief, the cause that Lincoln talks about without naming would have been preservation of the Union. The new birth of freedom caught people's attention, and certainly for people who thought that the whole point of the war was to end slavery, but this is what Lincoln is talking about, new birth of freedom. Certainly invites that interpretation. The demise of slavery was foreshadowed. Gettysburg was being looked upon as a turning point. It wasn't clear yet that they were going to prevail, but this is the center of the hope. And I think that increasingly it became more and more important. The new birth of freedom is the signal that that the real issue is slavery. Certainly, in our own time, the fact that the war was about slavery, which Lincoln says in his second inaugural, has come back very strong. People have forgotten that the war was about slavery. It wasn't about these other extraneous things. So I think that's the one that's strongest right now. But I want to close by suggesting that its real importance in the larger picture, the larger controversy, might be two things. One is a reinterpretation of the Declaration of Independence. And Gary Will's book gives voice to this, the words that remade America. Gary Wills, you remember, wrote a great book about Jefferson in the 70s. And one of the things he made very strongly was that it's just silly for people to think that I'm making that too strong, but that people thought that they didn't think about all men are created equal so much as Jefferson, 18th century idea about natural rights. They think about what Lincoln says about people in general, and that Lincoln, this isn't what the Declaration said. Well, I think that people agree with that, except that I think what Wills is saying in the second book is, so he reinterpreted. So he gave us a new interpretation of the Declaration. So that's great. Historically, it may not be accurate, or it may have a lot of problems, a lot of baggage historically, but that's what people think. It changed people's way of thinking about the whole idea of natural rights. All men are created equal. I certainly subscribe to that. I'm of a mind that that Lincoln thought longest and hardest about his first sentence, because I think he was trying to write a sentence that even his Democratic opponents, who hated the war and who hated him, and what he was trying to do, and thought that they had started a partisan war, a Republican war, dragged the country into this kind of mess, that he had them in a kind of, trap is a strange word, but for lack of a better. We got them to agree that our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Yeah. But then the next sentence says, now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation. And right there, the Chicago Times and the Democrats are going to say, wait a minute, we don't go along with that. It's too late. You've already gone along with the first premise, and that's the one that matters. At any rate, that's the way I've tried to make the case. I think Lincoln himself would have been interested and sympathetic with all of those points of view, glad to lend his name in his words to most of it. But for himself, I think if you judge by what he says in the 50s, and what he says in the first inaugural about self-government, which is only an experiment. Democracies haven't worked because it's not structured. So he avoids the word democracy by and large. He always says self-government. He says slavery is wrong because that's not self-government. If somebody else rules you, you're not. That's not self-government. So I think for him, especially the way he ends it, I think that he brings that home because that's a larger goal. Herndon says, Lincoln liked abstractions. We always think of Lincoln as this personable, warm, friendly guy. Herndon points out that he's always thinking in abstract terms. He has a very rangy mind. And I think that self-government is what he's talking about. That's why his speech ends by saying that these men shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish. I mean, Lincoln knew how to use the negative. If you want to really make that ending strong, you don't say, and that we will continue to have self-government. You say, not perish. And I think, given what he was saying all through the 50s about the necessity of having equality, freedom, to have self-government, that's what he's talking about here. And that the European countries are very suspicious of this. They don't think this will work. And of course, we're still having that argument. But I really think that he lands on what maybe for him would have been the most important part. So I think I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Hey, Karen.
Yeah, Doug, what would you say if I said that the Gettysburg Address was actually Lincoln's abstract for his 1864 campaign re-election, and that the Gettysburg Address was actually his first campaign speech?
I don't know what I'd say. I have to think about that. I think that the people make a good point in saying one of the reasons he wanted to come to Pennsylvania is you had to have Pennsylvania to win the election. He's already thinking about the election in 64, and he is up there talking to politicians and consulting. He had to come to terms with Curtin. Curtin was ambitious. He thought maybe he could beat Lincoln out of a second term. He was one of many. So that he went up to, that he did political fence mending and that kind of thing on his Gettysburg trip, certainly. But it was the opening shot of his campaign. I'd have to think about that. Do you have an idea?
Well, it just seems that when you really read the Gettysburg Address, I mean, you're thinking about the 13th Amendment, you're thinking about all of the other things that he accomplished in his second term, which really the Gettysburg Address supported very broadly, but it's almost like an abstract outline. Just a thought.
Okay.
Okay, who else? Yes. John?
Going back to the battle, a couple days after the battle, Lincoln is talking at the White House about 87 years ago, and this isn't the right time for my speech, but we need to have a time for a speech.
The July 7th.
On July 7th.
July 7th.
And then later in the summer, Governor Curtin comes to Washington a couple times. It's not until November 2nd that the formal invitation comes. What's the likelihood that Lincoln really was, setting up the invitation so he'd have the appropriate time to be able to make those remarks, and that he was thinking through all those months from July until November about what he'd say?
Very good. I'm with you all the way. I try to make the case in my book, A Lincoln Sword, that we have a good evidence, once we look at the right places, that Lincoln was a very deliberate creator of his own speeches. He didn't say stuff off the top. And Herndon describes how he wrote the House Divided speech. He says he kept writing little notes to himself, he'd tear off a scrap of paper and write something down. He kept all those things in his hat. When it came time to write the speech, he says he turned the hat over on the table, dumped all these out, and then he started arranging them, and then he numbered them, and then he wrote out his speech. Now that would be an anomaly if it weren't for the fact that we have other examples, and I could give them to you, but I'll just tell you the people who talk about this pattern. His son Robert says this is the way his father wrote, by making little notes on scraps of paper. I just said his law partner. His secretary Nicolay says the same thing, that he was always writing maybe just one word or a phrase, something on a scrap of paper. And Slade, Mr. Slade, his butler, says that he was always collecting these little pieces of paper Mr. Lincoln had written on and helping him keep track of it by rounding him up and handing it back to him. There's no question that he did that. Now, he gives the speech on July 7th, as you said, and he says to the audience, what a glorious thing. On the 4th of July, the enemies of the Declaration that says all men are equal, on the birthday of the Declaration, the enemies of equality turned tail and ran. And he says, this is a glorious theme, and I'm not prepared to give it right now. Now, you can't tell me that he hasn't got already in his hat. It turns out in the presidency, he used a drawer, had a certain drawer at his desk where he put all this stuff in. He once described to somebody, said, I really like that public letter you wrote to Erastus Corning. He said, when it came time to write it, I had it all right here. Sure. The idea of, this is one place where I disagree with Martin Johnson. He says, this speech, he had no preparation. He wasn't thinking about writing a speech until he got the invitation. He was busy, he had to write it on very short notice, and so forth. I can't believe that squares with what we know about the way he habitually wrote. And that he had a speech about equality, about all men are created equal, that he had been dying to give since the 50s. He probably had notes on it for then. So I'm persuaded that he, as you say, took advantage. This would be the perfect place to give my speech. But then, of course, you've got to get it written. And so he determines he's going to make it short. Then he makes the discovery that we all make. It takes more time to be brief than to write a long piece. So you make a great point, and I would agree that he had been thinking a long time about this subject. He says the central idea of American politics is equality. And one of the things he talks about is that even with, they got all these immigrants in his time, and the politicians worry about it because they want to know how those people are going to vote and so forth. But he says that even though these people can't identify with the revolutionists the way we all do, because they all thought about the revolution already, he says, when they hear us talk about all men are created equal, that resonates, that's not his word, but that's what it means. That resonates with them. And they identify with it, and they endorse it. So the idea that equality is the most important, most revered, resonant thing in American politics is one of his basic ideas, and it's right there in the first sentence.
Yes, growing up, I had always read that after he delivered the speech, most people and most newspaper accounts other than Hale did not think much of the speech. Is that in fact true? And at what time or what point did people awaken to the fact that it was a great speech?
The speech had admirers immediately, and prominent ones. The one that was most gratified to Lincoln, as you know, is Edward Everett himself, the nation's most esteemed orator. And he said to Lincoln, you said more in 2 minutes about the subject than I said in 2 hours. He valued that very much. He showed that letter to people. It's something that he didn't usually do. But certainly, it was a somber occasion. It wasn't an occasion where people throw their hats up in the air. And so there wasn't a big demonstration. But it was well noticed in various places. And this gives me an opportunity to read the view of Sumner that I had intended to finish with, but I got in a hurry, trying to be brief. Sumner said, Joshua Speed, Lincoln's Kentucky friend, said that in his memo, I wanted to record what Sumner had told him about the Gettysburg Address. Sumner said, of all the speeches he had ever read in any language, letting you know that he was a linguist, he read a lot of languages, by any man living or dead, he thought Lincoln's Gettysburg speech was the greatest. Remember, this guy is not entirely friendly to Lincoln, and he's certainly a guy who did not like the Second Amendment. Malice toward none? No way, I want to go down and hang those guys. He said, Lincoln said, the world will no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Sumner said, the speech would live when the memory of the battle would be lost, or only remembered because of the speech.
I am William Red from Pennsylvania. And I have two questions. In the first years of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln avoided sin. It was a civil war, right? But then in Gettysburg Address, he said, it really is a civil war. And what did Lincoln mean when he said, quote, a new birth of freedom? I think you mentioned that.
Yes, and I think a new birth of freedom does resonate about slavery, and he's not going to come right out and say that because that would, he's trying to get people to come together on first principles. That's his whole strategy as a politician. Don't alienate people. Talk about what you agree on. When they were starting the Republican Party, he kept saying, don't disagree in public. Just talk about what we really agree on, and then they'll remember what we stand for. But if you bicker all the time, but I do think that the new birth of freedom applies also to the idea of self-government, the idea that the cause of self-government is what is the larger thing that we're doing here because it involves the whole world. It isn't just this country, but it's the whole future and the whole of the world. So I think that's a good point. I don't think he'd like to talk about it as a civil war, but eventually he came around to it. He couldn't get his generals to stop talking about our territory and their territory. He kept saying, it's all our territory. Those people are Americans. They're on American soil. They're just in rebellion. We want to talk them out of it or fight them out of it. We want to get back. And of course, the thing I think that resonates so much with Lincoln in the world is that he did not do what Sumner and so many people thought he should do, which is to go down south and hang all those people who were responsible. He said, let's just obey the law and go back to what we were.
Well, I'm sure that everyone in here as a child was required to remember the Gettysburg Address. And do you endorse that now for children in school?
You know, I'm a great believer in memorization. That's maybe because it worked for me, and it was prominent. We've gradually gotten away from that. But no, I think memorizing things is useful. I know all kinds of people who tell me that having memorized so much poetry when they were young and in love with poetry, that they can continue to enjoy it and drive down the road and recite the Ode on the Grecian Earth. It's just lots of fun. Very satisfying.
What was the response that the Confederacy had towards the Gettysburg Address? How did the Confederacy respond to it?
You know, I have never looked into that. And you know, I think Civil War studies are so much Union-based that we don't hear enough about that. I think there's a lot to be learned from knowing what was going on in the South and what people were saying, what they were thinking. We can just about predict some of the things that they've said. It's not likely that they've said very many complimentary things because it's what you said in private is very different what you would say in the press. The press is going to take the national line, as it were. Lincoln does not rule out the valor or good intentions or whatever else about the Confederacy in the battle. The battle is decisive, and the good guys, as far as he was concerned, won. But he doesn't see. In case Lincoln couldn't come, they contacted Seward and said, "Would you be ready with a speech in case the president can't come?" Well, we know what he did. He gave it the night before. It's a standard kind of speech where he talks about the wickedness and of the opponents, and just completely the opposite of the way that Lincoln talked about the opponents. And I think that what people believe is that Lincoln got better results. Frederick Douglass says, we opposed him for all those years, but he finally got done what we couldn't do because we didn't have the right method. We were just antagonizing people. But they were doing more than that, of course. They were keeping the cause alive of freedom and the destruction of slavery. But Lincoln was trying to figure out how you did that, how you could get that done, and still have a country, still not shatter the sense of being of the nation.
Yes, sir.
Do you agree with Gary Wills that the Gettysburg Address is responsible for capitalization of the T in the United States?
The capitalization of
The T. The T.
the T?
Yes, it's the United States as opposed to a little T-H-E, United States.
Well, I'm not so keen on that as I think of Sandburg's way. He says, before they said the United States are, and after the war we say United States is. I would put it that way. But I think probably the idea is the same.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.